Thomas Caldwell pulled his jacket tighter as the cool autumn breeze whispered through the trees. The winding country road stretched before him, leading deeper into the Kentucky countryside. His old Ford pickup rattled over the uneven pavement, the sound of gravel pinging against the undercarriage as he checked his handwritten directions for the third time. "Take a right at the fork past Miller's Creek Bridge," he muttered to himself. "Look for the weathered sign marking Ford's Ferry Road." The assignment had seemed straightforward enough when his editor handed it to him 3 days ago. The Crittenden County Chronicle wasn't known for sensational stories, but with Halloween approaching, Beth had thought a feature on local haunted places might boost their dwindling readership. "Nothing too over the top," she told him, tapping her pen against her coffee mug. "Just something to give folks a little chill while they drink their morning coffee." Thomas had nodded, thinking it would be a simple piece about old houses with creaky floorboards and the power of suggestion. Then the name Pilot Knob Cemetery came up during his first interview, and the story took an unexpected turn. The road narrowed as he continued driving, tall oaks and maples creating a canopy overhead that filtered the late afternoon sunlight. His phone lost signal about 15 minutes back, the navigation app freezing before shutting down completely. Now he was following directions scribbled on the back of a gas station receipt, courtesy of a white-haired man who'd eyed him suspiciously when Thomas mentioned where he was headed. "Folks don't go up there much," the man had said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he drew a crude map. "Especially not with the sun getting low." Thomas had thanked him with a polite smile, attributing the man's unease to the superstitions that often surrounded old cemeteries. He'd interviewed enough elderly residents over the past few days to recognize the pattern. Initial reluctance to discuss Pilot Knob, followed by hushed stories told with darting eyes, as if someone might be listening. The road began to climb, and Thomas downshifted as his truck strained against the incline. According to his research, Pilot Knob Cemetery dated back to the early 1800s, established by the first settlers who carved out homes in this rugged part of Kentucky. It sat high on a hill that served as a natural landmark for river travelers, visible for miles around when the trees were bare. As the road crested the hill, Thomas saw the rusted iron arch that marked the cemetery entrance. He pulled over, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, taking in the scene. The graveyard wasn't particularly large, maybe an acre of land surrounded by ancient trees. Weathered headstones of various sizes dotted the gently rolling ground, some standing straight and proud, others tilting at odd angles, reclaimed by time and gravity. Thomas grabbed his camera, notebook, and digital recorder from the passenger seat. The cemetery looked ordinary enough in the fading daylight, but as he stepped through the arched entrance, a sudden stillness fell over the place. The wind that had been rustling the trees seemed to die away, and even the distant sounds of birds grew quiet. "Just the power of suggestion," he said aloud, his voice sounding strangely flat in the still air. Thomas began methodically working his way through the cemetery, photographing interesting headstones and jotting down dates and inscriptions. Many of the markers were too worn to read, their engravings smoothed away by nearly 2 centuries of Kentucky weather. Others told brief stories of lives long past, beloved wives, devoted husbands, cherished children taken too soon. It was near the center of the cemetery that he found what he was looking for. Set apart from the other graves was a small plot surrounded by an interconnected iron fence. Unlike the ornate Victorian ironwork around some of the other family plots, this fence was simpler, featuring a pattern of connected crosses. Inside the enclosure was a child-sized grave covered not with grass but with concrete and gravel. The headstone was relatively new compared to those around it, though still weathered by time. "Mary Evelyn Ford," Thomas read aloud, running his fingers over the carved letters. 1904-1910. He'd heard the story from at least 5 different locals, each version slightly different but with the same core elements. Mary Evelyn and her mother, outcasts in the small community, had been accused of witchcraft in the early 1900s. In a tragic episode that most historians would dismiss as impossible in 20th century America, both were allegedly killed by superstitious townspeople. The mother's body was said to have been taken away, but little Mary was buried here, in a specially prepared grave designed to contain her spirit. Thomas snapped several photos of the grave and fence, then stepped back to take in the entire scene. Something about the small plot felt wrong. Not supernatural, but sad. Whatever the truth behind the story, a child had died and been buried here, perhaps feared even in death. He walked the perimeter of the fence, noting how the metal had been driven deep into the ground with no gate or opening visible. It was as if the fence had been built not to keep people out but to keep something in. "You ain't from around here," a voice said, startling Thomas so badly he nearly dropped his camera. He turned to find an older man watching him from beside a nearby oak tree. The man was tall and thin, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt with a faded blue cap pulled low over his eyes. Thomas hadn't heard him approach, which was unsettling given the open layout of the cemetery. "No, sir," Thomas replied, trying to steady his breathing. "I'm from the Chronicle, working on a story about local history." The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Mary's grave. "History, huh? That what they're calling it now?" Thomas took a step toward him, extending his hand. "Thomas Caldwell. And you are?" The man ignored the outstretched hand. "Been a groundskeeper here going on 30 years. Seen all kinds come through. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, teenagers looking to scare themselves silly." He finally looked directly at Thomas. "But the serious ones, they always end up at her grave." "I've heard the stories," Thomas said, lowering his hand. "About Mary and her mother." The groundskeeper's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Stories. That's one word for it. Do you think there's any truth to them?" Thomas asked, slipping easily into interview mode. "Historical records from that time are spotty at best." "Truth?" The man almost smiled. "Son, in a place like this, truth isn't always what's written down in some dusty book. Sometimes truth is what people see with their own eyes, what they hear when nobody's talking." Thomas felt a familiar thrill, the one that always came when an interview subject veered into unexpected territory. "Have you seen something here? At Mary's grave?" The groundskeeper was quiet for so long that Thomas thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "I ain't saying I have, and I ain't saying I haven't. But I will tell you this. That little plot there, it's different from the rest. Ground never settles right. Plants won't grow inside that fence, not even weeds. And sometimes when the moon is right and the wind dies down like it is now, you can hear things that have no business being heard." The sun had dipped below the tree line while they talked, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees all at once, and Thomas suppressed a shiver. "Does it bother you?" Thomas asked. "Working here with all these stories?" The groundskeeper shrugged. "Dead folks don't trouble me none. It's the living you got to worry about." He glanced at the darkening sky. "You might want to head on out before full dark. These roads ain't friendly to strangers at night." Before Thomas could ask another question, the man turned and walked away, disappearing among the headstones with the same unsettling silence with which he'd appeared. Thomas checked his watch. The groundskeeper was right. He should head back before it got completely dark. But something made him linger, drawn back to Mary's grave like a moth to flame. As he stood there in the growing twilight, Thomas felt a strange sensation. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The cemetery felt suddenly vast around him, the distance between headstones stretching like an ocean. The silence deepened until he could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. Then, just at the edge of perception, something changed. Thomas would later struggle to describe it in his notes. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a presence, as if the very air had grown heavy with attention. He felt watched from all sides, observed by unseen eyes. "Hello?" he called, immediately regretting how his voice shattered the silence. No answer came, but as Thomas turned slowly in place, his recorder held out before him like a shield. He could have sworn he saw movement between the distant trees, a small, darting shape that vanished when he tried to focus on it. The rational part of his mind supplied explanations. A deer, a trick of the fading light, his imagination working overtime after a day of ghost stories. But another part, a deeper, older instinct, whispered that he was no longer alone among the graves. Thomas backed slowly toward the cemetery entrance, keeping his eyes on Mary's plot until the last possible moment. As he turned to leave, a cold breeze swept through the graveyard, carrying with it what sounded like the faint, distant laughter of a child. He walked quickly to his truck, not quite running but not dawdling either. The engine started on the first try, and Thomas felt a wave of relief as the headlights cut through the gathering darkness. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the cemetery fading into the night. There was probably a reasonable explanation for everything he'd experienced. The groundskeeper playing mind games, his own imagination fueled by local legends, the natural eeriness of old cemeteries. At sunset, that's what he told himself as he navigated the dark country roads back toward town. But Thomas knew he would be back tomorrow, and the next day, and probably the day after that, because whatever was happening at Pilot Knob Cemetery, whether history, legend, or something else entirely, it had just become more than a simple Halloween feature. It had become a story he needed to tell. Thomas woke early the next morning, his dreams filled with iron fences and whispering winds. The digital clock on his nightstand read 5:47 a.m., too early to be awake, but his mind refused to settle back into sleep. He sat up, reaching for the notepad he always kept beside his bed, and began jotting down fragments that lingered from his dreams. The small motel room felt stuffy, despite the October chill outside. Thomas had booked it for a week, longer than he'd initially planned for the assignment. Something about Pilot Knob Cemetery had gotten under his skin, and the practical part of him, the journalist who'd spent 15 years chasing down facts and verifying sources, wanted to understand why. By 7, he was showered and seated in the corner booth of a local diner, a stack of documents spread across the table and a mug of coffee warming his hands. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, refilled his cup without asking. "You're the newspaper fella, aren't you?" she asked, glancing at his papers. "The one asking about the old cemetery?" Thomas nodded. "Word travels fast." "Small town," she replied with a shrug. "Not much happens that everybody doesn't know by sundown. You planning on going back up there?" "Later today. I'm meeting someone from the Historical Society first." The waitress's expression flickered, something like concern passing across her face. "Just be careful up there. Some places—" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Never mind. Can I get you some breakfast?" After ordering, Thomas returned to his research. He'd spent hours last night combing through online archives looking for any historical record of Mary Evelyn Ford and her mother. What he'd found was frustrating, hints and fragments, but nothing definitive. According to county birth records, a Mary E. Ford had indeed been born in 1904, but there was little information beyond that. No newspaper accounts of witchcraft accusations, no trial records, nothing to confirm the gruesome story of their deaths. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Thomas looked up to see an elderly woman making her way toward his table. She moved, slowly but deliberately, leaning slightly on a wooden cane with a brass handle worn smooth by decades of use. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. "I'm Harriet Doyle, from the Historical Society." Thomas stood to greet her, clearing space at his table. "Thank you for meeting me, Mrs. Doyle. I appreciate your time." She settled into the booth across from him, carefully placing a leather satchel on the seat beside her. "When Ruth at the library told me a reporter was asking about Pilot Knob, I figured I should come see for myself. We don't get many outsiders interested in our local history. I'm working on a feature about haunted places in Kentucky," Thomas explained, sliding his notebook closer. "Pilot Knob Cemetery keeps coming up in my research." Harriet nodded, her eyes sharp despite her age. "And you've already been up there, I hear." "Yesterday afternoon." "And?" she prompted. "What did you think?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. "It's quieter than I expected. Peaceful, in a way, but also watchful," Harriet finished for him. That's what my grandfather used to say about it, like the place itself is aware of visitors. The waitress brought Thomas's breakfast and took Harriet's order for tea. When she'd gone, the older woman opened her satchel and removed a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "I brought something you might find interesting," she said, carefully unwrapping what turned out to be a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This belonged to Dr. William Thorne, the county physician from 1900 to 1932. He kept detailed records of his patients and the community. She handed the journal to Thomas, who accepted it with the reverence of someone who understood the value of historical documents. "There's an entry in there from June 1910 about the Ford family," Harriet continued. "It might help separate fact from fiction regarding little Mary." Thomas carefully opened the journal, finding the page Harriet had marked with a slip of paper. The handwriting was cramped but legible. The ink faded to a rusty brown. He read aloud, "June 17, 1910. Called to the Ford homestead near Pilot Knob. Child Mary E., age 6, with severe fever and delirium. Mother Louise distraught, refusing conventional treatment in favor of folk remedies. Condition worsened through the night. Child passed at dawn, June 18th. Cause appears to be meningitis. Mother's grief excessive concerning. Neighbors already spreading unfortunate talk." Thomas looked up from the journal. "So she died of meningitis, not the other way?" Harriet nodded, her expression grave. Dr. Thorne was a man of science, not superstition. But not everyone in the community shared his perspective. The rumors about witchcraft came later, after Louise Ford's own death. "What happened to her?" Thomas asked. "Official records say tuberculosis, winter of 1911. But by then, the stories had taken root. Louise was an outsider, you see. Came from somewhere up north, kept to herself, used herbs and remedies that weren't familiar to local folks. After Mary died, Louise became different. Talked to herself, wandered the woods at night. Grief can do strange things to a person." Thomas took notes as Harriet spoke, the journalist in him piecing together a timeline. "And the special grave? The fence?" "That was Louise's doing," Harriet explained. She was convinced the community had somehow caused her daughter's illness. In her grief, she had the grave prepared with concrete and the fence installed. Said she was protecting her child from the evil that took her. After Louise died, the stories grew more elaborate with each telling. The waitress brought Harriet's tea, then retreated quickly, clearly avoiding the conversation. Thomas noticed but didn't comment. "So there's no truth to the witchcraft accusations or the burning?" he asked once they were alone again. Harriet sipped her tea before answering. "Not in the way the stories tell it. But truth and legend aren't always separate things, Mr. Caldwell. Sometimes they wind together like vines on a fence." After breakfast, Thomas drove Harriet back to the Historical Society, a small building that had once been the town's first schoolhouse. Before getting out of his truck, she placed a wrinkled hand on his arm. "Be careful up at the cemetery today," she said, echoing the waitress's warning. "Not because of ghosts or witches, but because that place has a weight to it. History soaks into the ground like rainwater, especially when that history is painful." Thomas promised he would be careful, then watched as she made her way inside. The journal sat on the passenger seat where she'd insisted he keep it for his research. "Just return it before you leave town," she'd said. The drive to Pilot Knob took less time in daylight, the road less intimidating without the shadows of dusk. Thomas parked in the same spot as before, but this time he wasn't alone. A battered, blue pickup was already there, and a figure stood among the gravestones, the groundskeeper from yesterday. Thomas grabbed his camera and the journal, then made his way through the iron arch. The cemetery felt different in full daylight, less oppressive, though still unusually quiet. The groundskeeper looked up as Thomas approached, nodding in recognition. "Figured you'd be back," he said by way of greeting. "Most are, after the first visit." "I've been doing some research," Thomas replied, holding up the journal. "About Mary Ford and her mother." The groundskeeper grunted. "Find anything useful?" "Maybe. Mary died of meningitis, according to the county doctor. Not witchcraft, or anything supernatural. That's supposed to make this place less haunted? The groundskeeper almost smiled. Way I figure how a person dies ain't as important as what's left unfinished when they go. They walked together toward Mary's grave, the gravel crunching under their boots. In daylight, Thomas noticed details he'd missed yesterday. How the grass grew right up to the iron fence, but not a single blade penetrated inside. How the concrete covering the grave showed no cracks despite decades of freezing winters and baking summers. "You ever see anything here?" Thomas asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Anything you can't explain?" The groundskeeper was silent for a long moment, staring at the small grave. "About 5 years back, we had a big storm come through. Lightning hit one of those old oaks over there, split it clean down the middle. Next morning, I came up to check for damage, and there were footprints in the mud. Animal tracks? Small, child-sized, leading from this grave to the tree line and back. Perfect little footprints like someone walking barefoot after the rain." He glanced at Thomas. Ground was dry inside the fence. No mud, no tracks, no nothing. Just dry gravel like always. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "You think it was Mary?" "I think there are things in this world we ain't meant to understand fully," the groundskeeper replied. "And I think sometimes the dead have unfinished business with the living." As if on cue, a breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the autumn leaves. Both men fell silent, listening to the whispered sounds. "You know," the groundskeeper said finally, "there's someone else you might want to talk to. Old woman named Rose who lives out past the creek. She was friends with Louise Ford way back when. If anyone knows the real story, it'd be her." Thomas wrote down the directions to Rose's home, thanking the groundskeeper. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A small, pale wildflower growing at the base of the iron fence. It hadn't been there yesterday. He was certain. "That's new," the groundskeeper said, following Thomas's gaze. "Never seen anything grow that close to her fence before." Thomas crouched down to look closer. The flower was delicate with tiny white petals, the kind that typically bloomed in spring, not mid-October. "What do you make of it?" Thomas asked. The groundskeeper shook his head. "Change, maybe. Or a sign. In my experience, when things start happening differently around here, it usually means something's waking up." Thomas photographed the flower, then stood. "I'm going to come back tonight, set up some recording equipment." "Your funeral," the groundskeeper said. But there was no mockery in his tone, only caution. "If you're dead set on it, there's an old storage shed behind those trees. Keys under the flower pot. At least you'll have shelter if another storm blows in." As Thomas walked back to his truck, he felt the weight of the cemetery's silence pressing against him. Whatever was happening at Pilot Knob, whether natural or supernatural, fact or legend, he was committed to uncovering the truth now. The journal in his hand held some answers, but he suspected Rose might hold even more. And tonight, if he was lucky, the cemetery itself might finally speak. The dirt road to Rose's house wound through hills that seemed to fold in on themselves, each curve revealing another stretch of forest and farmland. Thomas checked the handwritten directions again, squinting at the mailbox numbers as he passed. The groundskeeper had warned him that Rose didn't have a phone and rarely went into town these days. "She's got to be pushing 90, he'd said. "But her mind's sharp as ever and she remembers things most folks want to forget." The small house appeared suddenly around a bend, a weathered wooden structure with a wide front porch and blue shutters that had faded to the color of a winter sky. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and an ancient-looking cat watched from the porch railing as Thomas parked his truck. Before he could knock, the door opened. The woman standing there was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were clear and alert, taking in Thomas with open curiosity. "You'd be the newspaper man," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Billy from the cemetery called on my neighbors, phoned to say you were coming. Said you're asking about Louise and her girl." Thomas nodded. "If you have time to talk, ma'am, I understand you knew them." Rose stepped back, gesturing him inside. Been waiting 70 years for someone to ask the right questions. Might as well be you. The interior of the house was warm and cluttered with the collections of a long life. Books, stacked on tables, quilts draped over furniture, photographs covering nearly every wall. Rose led him to a sitting room where a fire crackled in the stone hearth. "Tea?" she offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "Can't talk about the old days without something warm to drink." While Rose busied herself in the kitchen, Thomas studied the photographs on the mantel. Most were black and white or the faded sepia of early color prints, family gatherings, children in outdated clothes, landscapes that hadn't changed much in the past century. One photo caught his eye, two women standing in front of a small cabin, arms linked, both smiling. The first woman was clearly a younger Rose, her face unlined but recognizable. The second was taller, with dark hair and a direct gaze that seemed to look straight through the camera into Thomas himself. "That's Louise," Rose said, returning with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to Thomas. "Taken about a year before Mary got sick. Summer of 1909. Thomas accepted the tea and sat in the offered chair across from Rose's rocker. "The stories about them, about what happened, they don't match the historical records." Rose snorted softly. "Course they don't. People need monsters and magic to make sense of things that scare them. Truth is usually simpler, but not always." "Kinder." She sipped her tea, watching Thomas over the rim of her mug. "What do you know so far?" Thomas told her what he'd learned: Mary's death from meningitis, Louise's subsequent grief and death from tuberculosis, the rumors that followed. Rose listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. "That's the bones of it," she said when he finished. "But bones don't tell you how a person lived or why they died the way they did. Louise wasn't from here originally. Came from Boston after her husband died, looking for a fresh start. She was educated, read books, knew things about plants and healing that folks around here found strange." "Was she a doctor?" Thomas asked. "Midwife and herbalist. Back then, out in the country, that was as close to a doctor as most women ever saw. She delivered half the babies born in this county between 1906 and 1910, including my sister's boy." Rose's eyes grew distant with memory. She was good at it, too. Saved lives that the men doctors had given up on. That's where the trouble started. "Because she was successful?" Rose nodded. "Success breeds jealousy, especially when it comes from someone who's different. Louise talked different, thought different, didn't go to church regular, kept to herself except for her patients. When people don't understand something, fear creeps in." She leaned forward. "Then Mary got sick." Thomas took notes as Rose spoke, the story unfolding like a dark flower. According to Rose, Mary's illness came on suddenly. High fever, confusion, pain. Louise tried everything she knew, but nothing helped. "She called for Dr. Thorne eventually, but it was too late," Rose said. "After Mary died, something broke in Louise. She became convinced someone had poisoned her child, not with actual poison, but with hatred and fear. Said she could feel it in the air around their cabin like a fog." "Is that why she had the special grave made?" Thomas asked. Louise said. "She was protecting Mary, not containing her. The concrete and gravel was to keep people from digging her up. There'd been talk, you see, about the child not being right." "And the fence?" Rose paused, her gnarled hands wrapping tighter around her mug. "The fence was to keep others out, not Mary in. Those crosses were symbols of protection in Louise's beliefs." Outside, the light was beginning to fade. Thomas glanced at his watch, aware that he wanted to get back to the cemetery before dark to set up his equipment. "What about Louise's death?" he asked. "The records say tuberculosis." "Her body gave out, sure enough," Rose agreed. "But grief is what really killed her. By the end, she'd talk about seeing Mary in the woods, hearing her voice on the wind. Said her daughter was caught between worlds because of the anger directed at them." Rose's voice dropped nearly to a whisper. "The night before she died, Louise came to me, frantic. Said Mary was trying to tell her something about the cemetery. They're not letting her rest," she kept saying. Who wasn't letting her rest? Louise never said, and by morning she was gone. Rose set her empty mug aside. After the funeral, that's when the witchcraft stories really took hold. Easier to fear a dead woman than admit how she was treated while alive. As Thomas prepared to leave, Rose disappeared into a back room, returning with a small wooden box. These were Louise's, she said, placing it in his hands. Her healing journals and Mary's favorite hair ribbon, kept them all these years, waiting for someone who might understand. Might be they'll help you see what's really happening up at that cemetery. The box felt heavier than its size suggested. Why me? Thomas asked. Why now? Rose's weathered face creased in a sad smile. Because you're asking why, not just what. And because things are changing up there. I can feel it even from here. Whatever's been sleeping is waking up. As he drove back toward Pilot Knob, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the road, Thomas thought about Rose's words. The box sat on the passenger seat, still unopened. Part of him, the rational journalistic part, wanted to dismiss the old woman's talk of feelings and changes as the superstitions of someone from a different era. But another part remembered the strange stillness of the cemetery, the unexplained flower by the fence, the sense of being watched. That part wondered if perhaps the story of Pilot Knob was more complex than either history or legend alone could explain. He parked at the cemetery entrance just as the sun touched the horizon. This time he'd come prepared. A small tent, camping lantern, digital recorder, video camera with night vision capability, and thermal imaging device borrowed from a friend who investigated old buildings. If anything unusual happened tonight, he'd have evidence. The groundskeeper was nowhere to be seen, but he'd left the storage shed key where he promised. Thomas set up his base there, a small wooden building that smelled of old leaves and lawn equipment. He arranged his equipment on a workbench, checking batteries and settings before heading out to place devices around the cemetery. He saved Mary's grave for last. In the fading light, the iron fence cast strange, elongated shadows across the ground. The small white flower he'd noticed earlier had been joined by two more, creating a tiny cluster at the base of the fence. Thomas crouched to examine them, careful not to touch. Bloodroot, a voice said from behind him. Thomas jerked upright, nearly dropping his camera. A woman stood several yards away, mid-30s perhaps, dressed in practical outdoor clothing, a professional-looking camera hanging around her neck. Sorry, she said, raising her hand slightly. Didn't mean to startle you. The flowers, they're bloodroot. They usually bloom in early spring, not October. Pretty unusual. Who are you? Thomas asked, his heart still pounding from the surprise. Lily. Chen. I'm a photographer for Nature Midwest magazine. She gestured toward her camera. Doing a piece on Appalachian plant life. Saw your truck and thought I'd check if you were the property owner. She looked past him at Mary's grave. That's an interesting setup. Very old-school protection symbolism. Thomas studied her, suspicious of the convenient arrival of another person interested in the cemetery. You know about this place? Lily shrugged. I've heard stories. Hard not to when you spend time in these parts, the witch girl, the haunted fence, all that. Her expression turned more serious. But I'm more interested in why spring wildflowers are blooming in autumn around a century-old grave. That's not folklore. That's a botanical anomaly. Despite his initial wariness, Thomas found himself explaining his project, the newspaper, feature, his research, the contradictions between history and legend. Lily listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. So you're spending the night? She asked when he'd finished. Mind if I join you? These flowers shouldn't be blooming now. I'd like to document them, maybe take some soil samples. Thomas hesitated. On one hand, having another person present might be helpful if anything strange happened. On the other, he didn't know this woman, and her appearance seemed suspiciously well-timed. I don't mean to intrude, Lily added, seeming to sense his reluctance. But two observers are better than one, especially in places with unusual histories. I've got my own equipment in my car, and I'm used to overnight field work. Before Thomas could decide, a sound drifted through the cemetery, soft and distant like humming. Both of them turned toward the tree line, where shadows had deepened with the setting sun. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered. Thomas nodded, reaching for his recorder. The humming came again, a simple, childlike melody that seemed to float on the evening air. It lasted perhaps 15 seconds before fading away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. "That wasn't the wind," Lily said, her professional detachment slipping for a moment. "No," Thomas agreed. It wasn't. The last light faded from the sky as they stood there, two strangers bound suddenly by an experience neither could easily explain. Around them, the cemetery waited, ancient headstones standing silent witness to whatever might unfold in the darkness to come. "I think," Thomas said finally, "we might both have a long night ahead of us." Darkness settled over Pilot Knob Cemetery like a heavy blanket. Thomas and Lily worked quickly to set up their equipment before night fully claimed the grounds. The air had grown colder, their breath visible in small clouds as they moved among the headstones. "I've got motion sensors and infrared cameras," Lily said, adjusting a tripod near the cemetery's eastern edge. "Been using them to track nocturnal wildlife, but they should work fine for whatever might happen here." Thomas nodded, still not entirely convinced of her story, but grateful for the additional equipment and, if he was honest with himself, the company. The humming they'd heard hadn't returned, but the memory of it lingered, raising the hair on his arms whenever he thought about it. "You do this kind of thing often?" he asked, helping her secure a camera facing Mary's grave. "Spend nights in supposedly haunted places?" Lily's hands stilled for a moment. "Not officially, but I've always been drawn to places with stories attached. To them, the boundary areas. Boundary areas? Where different worlds meet," she said, her voice matter-of-fact rather than mystical. "Living and dead, past and present, known and unknown. You can feel it, can't you? The thinness here?" Thomas wanted to dismiss her words as New Age nonsense, but something about the cemetery did feel different, as if the normal rules were slightly altered, the familiar world just a step removed from where they stood. By 8 o'clock, they had transformed the small shed into a makeshift command center. Lily's laptop displayed feeds from 4 cameras placed strategically around the cemetery, while Thomas's audio recorders captured any sounds. They'd set up a small electric heater that took the edge off the autumn chill, its orange glow the only light besides their computer screens. "So what exactly are we hoping to see?" Lily asked, passing Thomas a thermos of coffee she'd brought from her car. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Evidence of something, anything that might explain why this place has the reputation it does, why people are still telling stories about Mary Ford a century after her death." "And what about you?" he added. "What are you really looking for?" "Out here?" Lily met his gaze steadily. "The truth, same as you." She hesitated, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn leather folder, but maybe with more personal reasons. She opened the folder to reveal yellowed newspaper clippings, old photographs, and handwritten notes. One photo showed a man in early 20th century clothing standing beside scientific equipment. Another showed what appeared to be a journal page covered in diagrams and observations. "My great-grandfather was a botanist who studied unusual plant growth patterns in this region," Lily explained. In 1912, he documented what he called anomalous flowering events at several locations in Kentucky, including a cemetery near Marion. Thomason leaned closer, examining the materials. "Pilot knob?" He never named it specifically, but the descriptions match. He noted plants blooming out of season, growing in patterns that defied normal behavior. His colleagues dismissed his findings as observational errors or hoaxes. She tapped one of the journal pages, but he was convinced something extraordinary was happening, that the plant life was responding to what he called non-standard energetic influences. "You mean ghosts?" Thomas asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Lily shook her head. He wasn't interested in the supernatural. He was a scientist looking for natural explanations for unusual phenomena. "When I saw your truck here and then noticed those bloodroot flowers, It was like his notes coming to life 100 years later. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees surrounding the cemetery. On the laptop screens, the headstones stood like silent sentinels, nothing moving except the occasional leaf blowing across the ground. "We should check the small flower cluster," Thomas suggested. "See if anything's changed since sunset." They bundled up and stepped outside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The temperature had dropped further, and the stars overhead seemed unusually bright, the Milky Way a smear of silver across the black sky. The bloodroot flowers glowed, faintly in the beam of Thomas's flashlight, their white petals almost luminescent against the dark earth. There were 5 blooms now, where there had been only 3 hours earlier, arranged in a perfect half circle at the base of the iron fence. "That's not possible," Lily whispered, crouching down with her camera. "Bloodroot doesn't grow that fast, and it definitely doesn't bloom at night in October." As she took photos, Thomas swept his flashlight across Mary's grave. The concrete surface remained unchanged, solid and impenetrable. But something about the gravel seemed different, as if it had been disturbed, subtle patterns visible in its arrangement that he hadn't noticed before. "Look at this," he said, pointing. "Does that look like—" "Footprints," Lily finished. "Small ones." They stared at the tiny impressions in the gravel, too perfect to be a trick of light and shadow. They led from the center of the grave to the fence, stopping precisely where the flowers had emerged. A sudden electronic chirp from the shed broke the silence, making them both jump. They hurried back to find one of the motion sensors had triggered. On Lily's laptop, the camera pointed toward the tree line showed nothing but darkness. "Wind, probably," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. They rewound the footage, watching carefully. At first, nothing seemed amiss, just trees swaying slightly in the breeze. Then, at the edge of the frame, a flash of movement. Thomas leaned closer. "There," he said, pointing to a pale shape that appeared briefly between 2 trees. "Can you enhance that?" Lily worked the controls, zooming in and adjusting the contrast. The image was grainy, indistinct, but unmistakably the outline of a small figure there and gone in less than a second. "Could be an animal," Lily suggested, but her voice had grown tense. "A fox maybe, or a possum." Thomas was about to agree when the audio equipment suddenly spiked, levels jumping across the screen. A sound filled the small shed, the same humming they'd heard earlier, but clearer now, captured by their sensitive microphones. The melody was simple, childlike, the kind of tune someone might sing while picking flowers or playing a game. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds before fading away, leaving them in stunned silence. Outside, one of the motion sensors triggered again, then another, creating a path of electronic chirps that moved across the cemetery toward Mary's grave. "We need to see this," Thomas said, grabbing his flashlight. "Wait." Lily caught his arm. "Look at the temperature readings." The digital thermometer they'd placed outside showed a sudden drop, from 48 degrees to 37 in the span of minutes. As they watched, it fell further, 34, 31, 28. "That's not normal," Thomas muttered, zipping his jacket higher. "No," Lily agreed. "But then, nothing about this place is." They stepped outside again, breath fogging heavily in the suddenly frigid air. The cemetery had changed somehow, the darkness between the headstones deeper, more absolute. Their flashlight beams seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the gloom. The motion sensors continued to trigger, one after another, leading toward Mary's grave. Thomas and Lily followed cautiously, recording devices in hand. When they reached the iron fence, they stopped short. The bloodroot flowers now formed a complete circle around the grave, dozens of blooms where there had been only 5 minutes earlier, their white petals glowing with a faint blue luminescence that didn't come from the flashlights. The tiny footprints in the gravel had multiplied, crisscrossing the surface in patterns that resembled a child's hopscotch game. "Thomas," Lily whispered, pointing to the center of the grave. A small depression had formed in the concrete, as if the solid surface had somehow softened. Within the depression lay a single object that hadn't been there before, a faded blue ribbon, frayed at the edges, but tied in a perfect bow. Thomas felt his blood run cold. He reached slowly into his pocket, fingers closing around the wooden box Rose had given him. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't examined its contents. "What is it?" Lily asked, noticing his expression. "Mary's ribbon," he said quietly. "Rose said her mother kept it after she died." Before Lily could respond, every motion sensor in the cemetery triggered simultaneously. Their equipment in the shed beeped and chirped in frantic chorus. The temperature plummeted further, frost suddenly appearing on the headstones around them, spreading like delicate white fingers across the carved stone. Then, from the tree line, came a new sound. Not humming this time, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the frost-covered ground. Thomas turned his flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught a tall figure moving between the trees, too far away to make out clearly. Not a child, an adult, moving with purpose toward the cemetery's edge. "Is that the groundskeeper?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas shook his head. Too tall, and Billy would have called out by now. The figure stopped at the boundary of the cemetery just beyond the reach of their lights. For a long moment, it remained motionless, as if observing them. Then it raised one arm, pointing directly at Mary's grave. The humming started again, but from a different direction, behind them now, near the iron fence. When they turned, the ribbon was gone from the depression in the concrete. The footprints in the gravel had vanished as well, the surface smooth and undisturbed. "This isn't happening," Thomas muttered, fighting the cold fear spreading through his chest. "It is," Lily countered, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented everything, "and we need to understand why." When they looked back toward the tree line, the tall figure had vanished. The motion sensors fell silent one by one, and the temperature began to rise slowly, frost melting from the headstones in glistening droplets. They retreated to the shed, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. Their equipment had captured it all: the temperature drop, the motion sensor activations, the humming. On Lily's laptop, the footage showed the bloodroot flowers blooming in accelerated time, growing and multiplying before disappearing entirely, leaving no trace. "What just happened?" Thomas asked, more to himself than to Lily. "What did we just see?" Lily was reviewing the footage frame by frame, her expression intense. "I don't know exactly, but I think we just witnessed a conversation." "Between who?" "Mary," she said simply, "and whoever that figure was in the trees, the one people around here call the Watcher." Thomas remembered what Rose had said about Louise's final words. "They're not letting her rest." Was the Watcher one of they? And if so, what did it want with a child who'd been dead for over a century? The wooden box seemed to grow heavier in his pocket. Whatever answers he needed, he suspected they might be found in Louise Ford's healing journals. The cemetery had fallen quiet again, but Thomas knew with absolute certainty that the night was far from over. Whatever had been sleeping at Pilot Knob was now wide awake. The small wooden box sat between Thomas and Lily on the workbench, its aged surface catching the light from their lantern. Outside, the cemetery had gone quiet again, but the memory of what they'd witnessed hung in the air like a fog. "You should open it," Lily said softly. Thomas nodded, his fingers tracing the simple clasp. The box had belonged to Louise Ford, had somehow found its way to Rose and waited there for decades. Now it had come to him, on the same night that Mary's grave had shown signs of, what? Awakening? Communication? He unlatched the box and carefully lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with faded twine, a small leather-bound journal, and a blue ribbon identical to the one they'd seen appear and disappear on Mary's grave. "I don't understand," Thomas murmured, gently lifting the ribbon. "How could this be here and there at the same time?" "Maybe it wasn't," Lily suggested. "Maybe what we saw was a reflection, an echo." Thomas set the ribbon aside and untied the bundle of papers. Most were handwritten notes about plants and their medicinal properties, The ink faded but still legible. Louise's healing knowledge, preserved for a century. Beneath these was the journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. The first several pages contained what appeared to be diary entries, detailing Louise's life in Marion after moving from Boston, her struggle to establish herself as a midwife, the suspicion she faced from locals, her devotion to her daughter Mary. She wasn't practicing witchcraft, Thomas said as he read. She was using herbal medicine, techniques she'd learned in Boston, things that would have seemed foreign to people. Here, knowledge is often mistaken for magic when people don't understand it, Lily replied, examining the plant notes with professional interest. They continued through the journal until they reached entries from June 1910, the month Mary fell ill. Louise's handwriting grew more erratic here. The words crowded together as if she'd been writing in haste or distress. June 16, 1910, Thomas read aloud. Mary complained of headache this morning. By afternoon, fever set in. I've given her willow, bark tea and cool compresses, but the fever rises still. She sees things that aren't there, calls out for people I don't know. I fear it may be the brain fever. The next entry described Mary's worsening condition, Louise's growing desperation as her remedies failed. The final entry, dated June 18th, contained just 3 lines. My child is gone. They've taken her from me. God forgive them, for I never will. Thomas looked up from the journal. Who is they? Who took Mary? Lily shook her head, but before she could answer, a sharp knock at the shed door made them both jump. The door swung open before either could respond, and the groundskeeper stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold air. You found it then, Billy said, his eyes fixed on the open box. Rose told me she'd given it to you. You know Rose? Thomas asked, standing up. Known her all my life. She's my great-aunt. Billy closed the door behind him, shutting out the night. Figured she'd decide it was time to share what she knew. The flowers are blooming again, aren't they? Thomas nodded. You've seen this before? Happens every few years. Always around the anniversary of Louise's death, not Mary's. That's why most folks don't connect it. They're looking at the wrong grave. Billy gestured to the journal. What's it tell you? That Mary died of meningitis. That Louise blamed someone for her death but doesn't say who. Thomas flipped through the remaining pages. The rest is blank. Billy shook his head. Not blank. Hidden. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. Lemon juice and heat. Old trick for secret writing. Louise knew people might search her things. She was careful. Under Billy's guidance, they carefully applied the liquid to the seemingly empty pages, then held them near the heater. Slowly, words began to appear, the hidden text revealing itself in faint brown lines. My God, Lily whispered as the full account emerged. Louise's secret entries told a different story than the official record. According to her hidden writings, Mary had indeed fallen ill with meningitis, but had begun to recover after Dr. Thorne's treatment. Then, 3 prominent men from town had visited their cabin, a local preacher, a businessman whose wife had lost a baby under another midwife's care, and the county judge whose sister had died despite Louise's attempts to save her. They came with purpose, Louise wrote. Not to check on Mary's health, but to test my faith. The preacher carried a Bible, demanded I swear upon it that I had made no deals with dark forces. The judge questioned me about herbs and potions, while the businessman watched from the doorway, saying nothing but seeing everything. The men had left, but that night Mary's condition suddenly worsened. Louise described finding a strange powder sprinkled around their cabin's perimeter the next morning, and footprints leading to their well. They poisoned her, Thomas said, looking up from the journal. Not with witchcraft accusations, but literally poisoned her water. Keep reading, Billy urged, his face grim. The final hidden entries described Louise's discovery of what had happened, her confrontation with the men, and their warning that she would meet the same fate if she spoke out. No formal accusations of witchcraft were ever made. They didn't need to be. The men had simply eliminated what they saw as a threat to their community's traditional ways, then let rumors and superstition cover their tracks. The fence wasn't to keep Mary in, Thomas realized. It was to keep them out, to protect her even in death. And the watcher? Lily asked, turning to Billy. The groundskeeper's expression darkened. That would be Judge Harlow. Died in 1915, but some say he still walks the boundary of the cemetery. Watching, always watching, to make sure his secret stays buried. But it didn't, Thomas said. Louise wrote it all down. And hid it where no one would find it, Billy added. Until the right time. Outside, the motion sensors began triggering again, a pattern moving from the tree line toward Mary's grave. The temperature readings dropped sharply on the monitors. He's coming, Billy said, moving toward the door. He always does when someone gets too close to the truth. The three of them stepped out into the cemetery. The night had grown utterly still, frost once again spreading across the headstones. Near Mary's grave, the bloodroot flowers had returned, their circle now complete, glowing with an eerie blue light that illuminated the small plot. At the edge of the trees stood a tall figure in old-fashioned clothes, its features indistinct in the darkness. As they watched, it began moving toward them with slow, deliberate steps. "What do we do?" Lily whispered, her camera forgotten in her hand. Billy reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. "Rose prepared this. Said you'd need it when the time came." He handed it to Thomas. "You found the truth. You need to end this." Thomas opened the bag to find dried herbs, small white flowers, and what appeared to be graveyard dirt. A note in Rose's handwriting explained what to do. With Lily and Billy beside him, Thomas approached Mary's grave. The iron fence gleamed in the moonlight, the crosses casting strange shadows on the frosted ground. The tall figure continued its approach, now close enough that Thomas could make out a stern face beneath an old-fashioned hat, eyes burning with a cold light. Following Rose's instructions, Thomas sprinkled the mixture from the bag in a line between Mary's grave and the approaching figure. As the dried herbs touched the ground, the bloodroot flowers pulsed brighter, their light spreading outward. "Mary Evelyn Ford," Thomas called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Your mother's words have been found. The truth is known. You can rest now." The humming began again, not from the grave but from all around them, as if the entire cemetery had joined in the child's melody. The tall figure stopped abruptly at the line of herbs, unable or unwilling to cross. From within the iron fence, a small shape began to form, not solid but not quite transparent either. A little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon. She didn't speak, but her expression shifted from solemn to something like relief. The tall figure raised its arm, pointing accusingly at the child, but its power seemed diminished now. The little girl turned away from it, facing instead toward the three living people who had uncovered the truth. She smiled, a simple, childlike smile, then slowly faded from view. The bloodroot flowers wilted and disappeared. The frost melted away. The tall figure at the tree line wavered like smoke in the wind, then dissolved into the darkness. The humming faded until only the natural sounds of the night remained. Crickets, a distant owl, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. "It's over," Billy said quietly. "After all these years." Thomas looked down at the journal in his hands, at the truth Louise Ford had hidden to protect her daughter's memory. "Not over," he said. "Just beginning." In the days that followed, Thomas wrote his story, not the sensational ghost tale his editor had expected, but a careful account of injustice, fear, and a mother's love that transcended death itself. Lily's photographs and scientific observations provided a record of the unexplainable events they'd witnessed, neither proving nor disproving the existence of ghosts, but suggesting that perhaps the boundary between worlds was thinner than most people believed. The town's reaction was mixed. Some dismissed it as fiction or blasphemy. Others, particularly the descendants of those who'd known Louise and Mary, found in it a kind of healing, a setting right of old wrongs. Rose read the finished article in her living room, Thomas and Lily, sitting across from her, waiting for her verdict. "You did good," she said finally, folding the newspaper carefully. Louise would be pleased. "Will it change anything at the cemetery?" Lily asked. "Will Mary truly rest now?" Rose smiled, the wisdom of her 90 years showing in her eyes. "Some places hold memory longer than others. Some stories never fully end." She reached out, patting Thomas's hand. "But truth has power. Always has." On his last day in town, Thomas visited Pilot Knob one more time. The cemetery felt different now, still quiet, still solemn, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the ancient ground. At Mary's grave, someone had removed a section of the iron fence, creating an opening where before there had been none. Fresh flowers, normal, seasonal ones, had been placed on the concrete surface. A small plaque had been added to the headstone, reading simply, "Beloved daughter, now at peace." As Thomas turned to leave, a warm breeze swept through the cemetery, carrying with it the sweet scent of wildflowers and, very faintly, the distant notes of a child's laughter, not sad or haunting, but joyful, free. Pilot Knob would always be known as Kentucky's most haunted cemetery. But now at least the haunting had a purpose, a meaning. And in that meaning, Thomas had found the story he'd truly come to tell.